Hello my dear viewers, thank you for stopping by. Well, for today's video lecture, we will be discussing one of the most influential topics in the literary criticism titled as An Apology for Poetry or The Defense of Poesy, written by Sir Philip Sidney. Now this wonderful piece of work was written in the year 1581 and got published in the year 1595, only after the death of Philip Sidney. An Apology for Poetry or The Defense of Poesy is considered to be the most passionate and spirited defense of poetry written in response to one of the puritanical writer's work, The School of Abuse. Well, Mr. Stephen Gosson was one of the puritanical writers who existed during Sidney's time. There were many puritanical writers back in those days who had issues with imaginative art. According to them, poetry was a complete waste of time, immoral and corrupt. Therefore, even Stephen Gosson published a magazine called The School of Abuse in the year 1579, in which he mocked and condemned poetry by calling it a complete waste of time, immoral and corrupt. He stated that the poets are liars. Poetry is the mother of abuse as it nourishes lies, and philosophers like Plato had rightfully banished all the poets from his work Republic. Now, Philip Sidney, in his text An Apology for Poetry, had systematically refuted or rejected all the charges or allegations that were leveled against the art of poetry. In order to build a logical argument, Sidney had divided his text into 7 different sections, and he had also employed the conventions of classical oration. It's due to this systematic division of the text, An Apology for Poetry turns out to be most logical, clear, and a highly persuasive literary text. Well, before understanding each of the 7 sections, let us quickly have a brief insight into the life and works of Sir Philip Sidney. Sir Philip Sidney was one of the most renowned English poet, soldier, and courtier, who was popular as the most influential and the towering figure of the English Renaissance. He was born in the year 1554 on 30th of November at Penhurst, Kent. Sidney comes from a highly influential aristocratic family. His father, Henry Sidney, was the President of Wales, whereas his mother, Lady Mary Dudley, was the eldest daughter of the Duke of Northumberland, and she was also the sister of the first Earl of Leicester, Robert Dudley. Sidney's family had extremely close connections to the Elizabethan court. The family was very close to the Queen Elizabeth I. Due to this, Sidney held various positions at the court. He served as a diplomat, courtier, and also actively handled all the political affairs. He even objected Queen Elizabeth I's marriage to the Duke of Anjou. Sidney received an excellent education from Shrewsbury and also from Oxford. He extensively travelled across the Europe between the years 1572 and 75, where he engaged with the Protestant leaders. He fought in the battle for the Protestant cause, in which he got shot in his thigh, due to which he developed an infection and died several days later. He died on 17th of October 1584. Being a highly influential figure, his death was mourned throughout England, and he was given an extremely grand public funeral at the old St. Paul's Cathedral. Talking about Sidney's major works, despite being an influential figure of his time, none of his works were published during his lifetime. All of his works were published only after his death, and that too due to the efforts of his sister Mary Sidney Herbert, who is also known as the Countess of Pembroke. Some of the major works of Philip Sidney are the Countess of Pembroke, also known as the Arcadia. Now, this particular work was composed in the year 1580 and was published sometime in the year 1590s. Now, this particular work falls under the genre of pastoral romance. It contains two versions: the old Arcadia, which was originally written for the entertainment of his sister, filled with disguises, mistaken identities, and romantic entanglements. The later version, also known as the New Arcadia, therefore Arcadia is considered to be one of the most influential work of prose fiction. The second famous work by Sidney is Astrophel and Stella, which was published in the year 1591. Now, this particular work is a sonnet sequence containing about 108 sonnets and 11 poems. It focuses on the theme of unrequited love. Astrophel, which means the star lover, refers to the poet Sidney himself, whereas Stella, the star, refers to his love interest. Therefore, the sonnets deal with the passionate love of the poet and also his internal struggles and his attempts to reach out his love. We then have an apology for poetry, which was published in 1595. Apart from this, we have the Sidney's Psalms, which started by Philip Sidney and completed by his sister Mary Sidney. These are the biblical translations in English language. The first 43 Psalms were written by Philip Sidney before his death, and the remaining 107 Psalms were completed by his sister Mary Sidney. Sidney had also written some of the shorter poems, which were titled as miscellaneous poems or certain sonnets. Despite his short life, he had left a legacy and a benchmark in the English literature. Well, that was a very quick insight into the life and works of Sir Philip Sidney. Let us now try to understand. The first section of an apology for poetry is the exordium or the introduction. Now, Philip Sidney begins by humorously recounting an incident where a horse master, John Piotto Pagliano, goes out of his way in praising his horses in an eloquent manner. Now, Sidney presents this as an ironic parallel and states that if horses could be praised with such eloquence, poetry surely deserves a better defense. He says he was inspired to write this defense by this incident of the horse master. He states that even the most practical men should understand the power of words. He then laments the degraded state of poetry and feels and expresses his sorrow that poetry, the form of art which was once revered and respected, has now turned into a laughing stock. Sidney doesn't present himself as a poet seeking for validation or praise. He rather presents himself as a poet lover defending the noble art. In the second section, which is the narration, Sidney shifts the reader's attention to the historical significance and the universal esteem of poetry. Sidney argues that poetry is one of the oldest forms of learning preceding history and philosophy. It has been the earliest forms of learning in most of the cultures, including Greek, Roman. He emphasizes on the fact that people in the ancient times, especially the Greeks, often revered the poets. They respected them, held them in high regard, and often called them the prophets or the diviners. He also focuses on the Latin etymology of the word poet, which is waits, which literally means the makers. He thus states that poets are the makers or the creators of art. He also highlights how poetry had played a significant role in civilizing ancient societies, teaching virtue and inspiring noble actions through captivating narratives. In the third section, which is the propositio e divisio, that is, proposition and division, Sidney lays out his core argument, focusing on the nature and purpose of poetry. He says that the very nature of the poetry is to imitate. He calls poetry as the art of imitation, but not a mere photographic imitation of the reality. It is rather a much better version of reality. As poets are creators, he states that the real world or the nature is brazen. Poets, through their creativity and imagination, turn this brazen nature into golden. Thus, the art of poetry has a power to depict the brazen nature into an ideal perfected reality, all its flaws and imperfections. He also states that the ultimate purpose of poetry is to teach and delight. Sidney focuses on the fact that poetry is not just an aesthetic form of entertainment. It not only teaches and delights people, but also it pushes them to act virtuously. In the fourth section, which is the confutatio or the refutatio, Sidney refutes or rejects all the charges or allegations that were leveled against the art of poetry by Stephen Gosson. Now, Stephen Gosson made an allegation that poetry is a waste of time. To this, Sidney argues that there is no art as valuable as poetry, as the art of poetry not only entertains, delights, and teaches people, it also drives them into virtuous actions. Therefore, something which drives people into virtuous actions can never be a waste of time. To the second charge of Stephen Gosson, which is the poets are liars, Sidney in his famous counter-argument says, the poet never affirmeth, therefore he never lies. By this he meant that poetic fictions are not meant to be taken literally, but as illustrative examples of universal truths. To the third charge, which is poetry is the mother of lies, Sidney argues that poetry can often be misused. Therefore, the fault lies with the corrupt readers and the corrupt poets, but not the art of poetry. The problem lies with those who wrongly interpret poetry, but not the art of poetry itself. But there's nothing wrong or immoral or lie in the art of poetry. He asserts that the true poetry aims for moral good. To the last allegation of Stephen Gosson, that Plato had banished all the poets from his republic, Sidney argues that Plato had banished only the corrupt poets who corrupted the young minds, but not all the poets or the poetry itself. He also states that Plato himself had used poetic forms in his philosophy. The fifth section, which is the confirmatio or the proof of the argument, Sidney builds a positive case for poetry by comparing it with the other disciplines of learning such as philosophy and history. In this particular section, he compares philosophy with poetry and says that philosophy presents abstract precepts. It presents how the world should be, but it fails to move the individuals into virtuous actions. He then compares history with poetry and says history mainly focuses on the past. It is bound by what has already happened, whether good or bad, but it never presents what is ideal. Whereas poetry, on the other hand, is a perfect mixture of abstract ideas, historical examples, and also moves the individuals to act in a virtuous manner. Therefore, poetry contains speaking pictures. Sidney also defends specific genres of poetry such as epic, lyric, tragedy, and comedy. In the sixth section, which is the digression or the digression, Sidney takes a moment, he takes a brief interlude to lament on the present status of the poetry, which is completely degraded and fallen. The poetry nowadays lacks inventive genius. He condemns it for the poor imitation of classical form, misuse of rhyme and the failure of contemporary drama to stick to the proper unities. Despite all his criticisms, he expresses his hope for the future of poetry. In the last and final section of his poetry, which is peroratio or the conclusion, Sidney summarizes his argument. He urges them to recognize the ancient glory of poetry and also its vital role in fostering virtue. He concludes his text with a playful curse on those who remain unappreciative of poetry, suggests that they are being at the risk of not being noticed or not having any verses written about them in poetry. Thus, we can say that the text in Apology for Poetry is a cornerstone of the English Renaissance. That was all for today's video lecture. I hope you all enjoyed watching it. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, please do subscribe and also hit the bell icon so that you never miss an update. I shall meet you soon with yet another topic. Until then, goodbye and stay tuned.